Everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I was looking at our attendees and it looks like there's a lot of school psychologists on the call. So just so you kind of know what this presentation will cover, we are just kind of going to go over what school psychology is, because not everyone on the call is a school psychologist, and it's always helpful to know how we can advocate for our services and language to use when talking about what we are trained in and what we can do. And then I'm just going to give you guys some examples of what one school psychologist in one district in Colorado has been doing for remote learning. I'm really fortunate in that I work in a district where I am within the NASP ratio of 1 to 500 students. I've got an awesome mental health team in my building, so happy to hear what you guys are doing as well in the chat box if there's anything you want to share. But just a little bit about me. I work in Aurora Public Schools in Colorado. It's an urban district that's really diverse. I work full-time at a preschool through 8th grade school, and I really get to work within the practice model. So I really do all the different pieces of the job of a school psychologist. And one of those is to provide mental health services for 30 students with IEPs. The students in my building are all at the mild moderate level of need. We don't have any center-based programs, but we also are a pretty small school. We've got about 50 students per grade. So I can talk through what it's looked like to think about working towards mental health IEP goals during remote learning, and how I've been connecting and working with my students. I'm also a member of my district crisis team, and we have had teaming together to figure out how to do crisis response for non-COVID related crisis during remote learning. A lot of my work is with culturally and linguistically diverse students. I think about 70% of our student population speaks English as a second language, and we have a really high refugee population. So I'm definitely going to bring that lens of equity and how we think about providing services and making sure they're accessible to all different types of students. And then my affiliation with NASP is I'm a member of the Government and Professional Relations Committee. And in case you're wondering, the pig in the picture, that's Katniss Eversqueal. That was one of the best days at work of my life. We did a self-care day for staff. And I really like Harry Potter. And that's just a little bit about me. So just kind of for context about what my school district looks like. 5th largest school district in Colorado, about 40,000 students. Our students are from 130 countries, 160 different languages. I'm really proud of the work my district has done in the value of mental health, and I know this isn't the case around the country or even around Colorado. There's a huge need for mental health in schools. I believe there was a recent report that came out that superintendents identify mental health needs as one of the top things that is needed in public education right now. So it's been really exciting because our voters approved a mill levy, which allowed us to hire 100 additional mental health providers. So we have a really extensive mental health and counseling team. I work really closely with our social workers and school counselors, and a lot of our schools have school-based mental health therapists as well. So I'm coming from a district that has a lot of embedded supports and a lot of focus on being trauma-informed, thinking about what trauma does to the brain. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we're talking about providing remote services during a collective crisis. And sustainable wellness. So really the idea that it's not just self-care, but what are we doing for ourselves that's sustainable in the long run so that we can continue doing this work. This is not easy to do our jobs remotely. So as we're talking, just know that I don't think there's such thing as an expert in remote learning right now. We've all been kind of building the plane while it's flying. So these are some ideas that I hope are helpful and kind of just spurn some ideas for how we can meet the needs of kids. So for those not familiar with NASP, and Kelly, please feel free to jump in. I borrowed this language from the NASP website, but it's the National Association of School Psychologists. There are members from all around the world, over 25,000, and they put out a ton of amazing resources, particularly specific to COVID-19, that will make sure everyone knows where to go to access those and what types of resources are available. And that the organization is really involved in advocating for kids to be successful at home, school, and throughout their life. So providing resources, professional development opportunities, trainings, and then just connection with other colleagues. Kelly, is there anything you wanted to add about NASP?
No, I think you covered it. It's a great place to work, and we're happy to have Brittany on our team. I'll add that.
Okay, so for a lot of you who are school psychologists, this first part is kind of just going to cover what our roles are. Then we're going to talk specifically about what are some supports we can provide to students during remote learning and this pandemic. One of the things that we've done in my district and that I've developed for my students are home programs. So individualized for each student, what are some ways they can continue to work on their IEP goals using resources and programming in the home environment. And then we'll touch a little bit on how we respond to crisis during a pandemic. And there will be plenty of time to ask questions, so please, I'd love to have it be more of a back and forth conversation. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so NASP has created a lot of these really awesome infographics. So I will put a plug in if you are in a district where maybe you're not able to practice within your full scope of training, or maybe you've had a really big role in evaluation and now that's looked really different because of remote learning. It's a really great time to advocate for all the things that school psychologists are trained to do and all the ways that we can help kids, families, and staff during remote learning. So this little infographic is a really great digestible tool for families, community members, people in a school who might not always know exactly what a school psychologist does. But we are uniquely qualified members of school teams. We've got tons of training in how kids learn as mental and behavioral health providers, and helping teachers teach, with systems level thinking, looking through different tiers of intervention. We really support the whole child and thinking about all the pieces that go into that. So their learning, what's going on in their social environment, are there behaviors that are impacting their access to education? How are they functioning emotionally? And we partner. I don't know about you guys, I've spent a ton of time during remote learning on lots of different calls to the different teams I'm a part of. So we have MTSS teams we might be a part of, family school partnering teams, mental health teams in a school, special education teams, administrative teams. So thinking about all the different ways we have our expertise and can lend that point of view in supporting kids. So even though we have really extensive training, I think what we see is when we look state to state or even district to district, the role and how school psychologists are utilized in a school can look really different. So I think it's just always helpful to just really think about all of the different ways that we're trained, and especially during a time where there is a collective crisis going on, how can we draw on those experiences we have? So these are, for those of you who are school psychologists, you maybe are remembering back to grad school and all these different classes. Maybe some of you are getting to do a little bit of all of this in your jobs. Maybe some of you are really heavy in one particular area. But for those who on the call who are not school psychologists, these are all of the ways in which we're trained. School psychologists have at least master's levels up to doctorate levels of education, really extensive internship and practicum, supervised experience, and many programs are and school psychologists get the National Certified School Psychology certification through NASP, which is another way to ensure that your training has met really rigorous standards. So school psychologists are highly, highly trained. So I won't read this whole list. And I believe all of these slides will be available and sent out. So we have a practice model that we work within, and very, very, very recently, a new one was released. I believe just this month. And so this is the new graphic, which I'm not super familiar with quite yet because it is different than the one we've used. But these are all of the ways we should be functioning in a school. So having pieces of doing academic intervention and supports, that might look like supporting on an MTSS team for a student who's struggling in reading, or doing some tier 1 data collection to determine, are there groups of students that are struggling and what interventions need to be in place there. I think a big one is mental and behavioral health services. School psychologists aren't always utilized in that role. I feel really lucky because that's one of my favorite parts of my job, and that's a huge part of my role at my school and in my district. Having that school-wide lens, ensuring safety, working with our families, consulting with teachers, making sure we're using research and evidence, thinking about equity. How do we make sure that all of our students have access? And I think that's a really important thing for us to consider right now. We can talk about that a little more. But anyway, this is the new NASP practice model. If you would like to really dig into all the changes and dig into what it looks like, you can access this resource on the NASP website. I want to talk really quickly about ratios, because as we're talking through what some of my remote service provision has looked like, I am able to do this as a provider who is working within the NASP ratio of 1 to 500. That is most certainly not the case across the country. There are nationwide school psychology shortages, which have a really negative impact on kids. So advocating for the importance of our roles, particularly when we know that funding streams are really shaky right now. We're not sure what funding for education is going to look like in the coming months, years. Really advocating for the importance of our role. And if you are a school psychologist whose ratio is 1 to 2,000, 1 to 3,000, 1 to 1,000, it's really hard to work within that whole practice model and meet the needs of all of our students. So just really encouraging being able to have us work within ratios. And then for those who are not school psychologists, every school should have access to the services of a school psychologist. You might not have one in your building every day of the week. It might be 1 or 2 days a week. You might have several school psychologists who service your building, but you should be able to locate their information through your school district central office or your school directly. And then why are we important for kids? I mean, that's the reason we do this job, right? Is we want to support kids. We want to help them. So all kids struggle at times. It might be something that occurs over their lifespan. It might be something that occurs in a short term. And we're there to help them get over those barriers and create systems that are sustainable to help them continue to learn and grow. We partner with not just kids in a school building, but really every aspect of our communities, looking at short-term issues and then chronic problems, which I think is at the forefront, at least of my mind right now, thinking about, what could be the really long-lasting impacts of this shutdown for some of the kids I work with. How am I gonna really support and collaborate with my teammates to ensure their needs are being met when we come back from remote learning, whenever that might be? You know, we're a really important resource for kids. Schools are the main source of student mental health care in the nation. We are the #1 providers of mental health services for children. And so our roles really can't be understated, especially right now. So I know we have a lot of school psychologists on the call, but maybe there's some that just have general questions about school psychology, or if anyone's not a school psychologist, this is a chance to kind of ask any questions.
So we do have one question. We do have several people who are sharing their ratios, and I think, like you predicted, there are a lot of people that are not, that are working well outside of the 1 to 500 ratio. So I'm going to ask you a question in a minute about that. But one question that was asked was, are you guys in your school district, are you identifying school psychologists as the provider of services and goals in students' IEPs?
So in my particular school district, yes, as a school psychologist, I would provide, or a school social worker can provide the mental health service time. I believe in other districts and in other states, it could be school counselors or other providers who do that. And sometimes school psychologists are not responsible for providing those services. But in my district, I am.
So some other people have noted that they are not written in as a service provider because of their crisis response goals, and that that could be a reason that some in other districts they're not listed in that way. I'm just curious, because you are fortunate enough to work in a district where you have where you really have a great ratio. Before we move on, I'm just from your perspective, do you have any advice to others who might be in districts where they're working towards a better ratio so that they can provide those broad-based services? What advice would you have to those school psychologists in that district to help make the case? Because I know that in Colorado, you guys have done a lot of advocacy to make sure that you've gotten to the point that you are now, and would love if you could share some advice to other folks.
Sure. I think getting involved and talking to your decision makers is really important. In my district, I joined our teachers union and joined our budget committee to talk about salary negotiations and what's in our contract, because I realized there wasn't a special service provider, there wasn't a mental health provider, there wasn't a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist. Those voices weren't being represented. And I thought that was a really important thing to make sure that our school board and our superintendent and our school principals knew about, was the needs of special service providers. Talking to your elected officials, I think a big reason for some of our shortages is funding, and making sure that elected officials recognize the importance of school psychologists, why it's important to provide funding for us. And NASP has some really incredible resources. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's an entire section of the NASP website completely dedicated to how to advocate for you as a school psychologist and the field. So, and it's even targeted to, are you going to talk to your principal? Are you going to talk to your superintendent? Are you contacting your state senator? And then getting involved with your state associations. A lot of times state associations might be working with lobbyists or have a government and professional relations committee of their own that are familiar of what your particular state looks like in terms of mental health funding and how school districts are using services. So I think this is, for those of you who might have attended the Public Policy Institute in the past, this is kind of the quintessential quote, but if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So making sure you're always a part of those conversations.
Great. Yeah, I think I'm just scrolling through some of the chat, and there's a comment that because of the limited view on the role of school psychologist, or the fact that we have such a high caseload, and perhaps people think we only do testing, that some folks have been left out of the conversation around distance learning, especially when we're talking about how to meet our kids with the most significant needs. And, I would argue that the school psychologist is one of the most important people to have at the table as we're thinking about this. So, I just think that I can't keep up with the messages that are coming in so fast about everybody kind of talking about how they are experiencing shortages and how that's impacting their ability to provide high need services. But we can make sure that we can follow up with an email after this webinar and make sure that we pull out some of those specific resources that Brittany mentioned, because I think when we're talking about how to best serve kids, having adequate access to school psychologists is a critical component of making sure that school districts can do that. So we'll make sure that we share all of that stuff with you, and hopefully, and we're also happy, Brittany is a member of the GPR committee, and one of the roles of that committee is specifically to help school psychologists advocate for evidence-based policies and practices that meet the needs of your school population. And part of that work is making sure that schools have access to the right professionals. And I think that's really been amplified during COVID. It's just how critical we all are. So
yes, that's a great segue to this slide, because that was exactly my point I was going to make, Kelly, was we are seeing a huge recognition nationally about how important mental health is in schools right now. And there is a lot of nerves in the general media about like, what are the needs of kids going to be and how are we going to meet them? So this is an already happening conversation. I mean, we've got school psychologists called out in the Wall Street Journal. The Los Angeles Times wrote a really big article about how we prepare. So this is a unique time to advocate, because the ability for us to do some parts of our job are really impacted right now. And it's a great time to use the really broad range of skills we're trained in and to say, hey, you haven't used me this way, but I can do this and I can help here. And this is a need. And this is a conversation that's happening, and I want to be a part of it. So I just thought it was cool. There's just a lot of media coverage, right? If you just type in to Google like school psychologists and then hit like the news, so many articles come up, which is not always the case. So we're definitely a part of the national conversation. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the NASP specific resources for COVID. And Kelly, just to clarify, because I am a NASP member, so I definitely have access to all these. Are these open to the general public, or do you need to be a NASP member to access all of these?
no, everything that's listed in the COVID-19 Resource Center is freely available to the public, so you can access it without being a member. You can share it with whomever you want. We are creating a series of webinars that are very specific to how to provide very specific types of academic and mental health interventions. Those will be restricted to NASP members, but the vast majority of everything on this page that you have up is publicly available.
Okay, so NASP does an extraordinary job of creating really high quality resources really quickly. So very soon after the pandemic became a reality, resources were available and are continually updated. I believe, Kelly, before we started the webinar, you were saying that there's another resource coming out June 1st that will look specifically at, I'll let you finish that sentence.
Yeah, so we have partnered with the American School Counselor Association. I think to Brittany's point about the importance of teaming and collaboration, it's a lot of the work that we do. And it is considerations it's a considerations document on how to support students' social emotional learning and mental and behavioral health as schools think about reopening. We recognize that schools across the country might be in various stages of reopening in the fall, but it outlines a lot of questions that we really want school leaders to be thinking about and being very planful over the summer to make sure that they have a whole range of supports and services for all kids, but especially for some of our kids who really struggle with social emotional learning and have had some mental and behavioral health issues during, before schools closed and perhaps during school closures. So that's coming out hopefully within the next week. And we'll be sure and share that with ELA so that it's available on the ELA website as well.
So I took a screenshot yesterday of what's currently being highlighted on the NASP website, but I bet if I looked next week or the week after, this list would look different because they're so frequently updating things with the current evidence that's available, really responding to current needs. So I really, really encourage, like maybe you're thinking about, gosh, for the fall, we think we might be going into remote learning, and we really need to tighten up how we do our suicide risk assessments and think about what that could look like remotely. NASP has an awesome resource about, hey, this is how you can think about what that would look like remotely. Here's a sample plan you can modify to your needs. So really encourage checking this because it can be really helpful. Also, NASP does a great job of staying on top of what all the current guidance is coming from the federal government. And so making sure that we at the district level are always in compliance and navigating the very quickly changing guidance, regulation, policies as they change. And then I pulled this directly from just one of, I think, the more powerful and accessible to the general public resources NASP has about just overall in general, what are just some things we as a society, as families, as educators, as just people can do to help kids. So a lot of these things our school psychologists do and model, but just really making sure we're being calm, offering reassurance to our kids, taking time to talk with them, and limiting our TV viewing and social media. That's a great strategy for adults too. A lot of families I have talked to have been very overwhelmed by the constant media and the news stories in the background. So encouraging just shutting that off sometimes and giving yourself a break. Staying connected to school. Remote learning has really shined a big light on equity and access to technology and technological literacy. Not every family and kid has the same access. So how do we make sure they're connected? How do we think outside the box and come together with our teammates to make sure every kid's getting access? Making sure we know the symptoms. There are some really phenomenal children's books that have come out, which I link later in this presentation, that's specific to COVID and is available in dozens of languages. That's really helpful for some of our kids that are having some really high anxiety right now. Making sure we're modeling that good hygiene, and then just making sure we're checking in with our kids and knowing the signs and doing some psychoeducation with our school communities about what to look for. So this is, like I said, pulled from a NASP resource that was linked previously. So does anyone have just general questions about how to utilize NASP as a resource right now? Types of COVID-19 specific things that are available? Now is a great time to ask.
Pillsbury always is successful.
Okay. So now we're going to talk.
Yeah, I don't see any questions coming.
All right, well,
no,
if you have NASP questions, I would say Kelly would be your person to ask, as she has a big hand in developing a lot of all these resources. So now we're going to talk kind of more specifically about what we as school psychologists can do to support our students with COVID. This is not an exhaustive list. Again, this is an example of one school psychologist in one district who did the very best she could. So I'm sure that there are some fantastic ideas you guys have all implemented and used, so feel free to share that in the chat box as well while we're talking. I think the biggest thing for us to take away is there is no one size fits all approach. We all work with very different kids, communities, parts of the country, school systems, and we're all different in who we are and what we bring to this profession. So what works for one person won't work for someone else, and what works for one kid might not work for another kid or family. Always, always, always defer to your district and state guidelines. They can look really different state to state and district to district. So nothing, ideas that are shared here, make sure that it is in line with how your district and state is approaching remote learning. So making sure you're staying on top of that. A lot of times your state associations have good guidance, or your state departments of education. Really thinking about equity, that's something I've really needed to think about a lot, because, you know, I'm thinking about, I want to try to still run a social skills group, but I need to think about how to really give informed consent given the nature of the pandemic. And I have one family who's a refugee family that speaks Nepali, and another family, maybe a parent doesn't have literacy skills, and another family doesn't really have access to consistent internet. So is it equitable to try to run groups? Do I need to rethink about how I'm meeting the students' needs? How are we making sure families have access to things in their language and their level of understanding? How do we make sure that we're meeting the kids where they're at? You know, I've had some kids that have some pretty lofty goals, but in real time, they're having a meltdown because their entire schedule and things they're used to is completely out the window. And that's really the more critical piece to help the families with at the moment. And then really thinking about using trauma-informed approaches. So knowing that when we're experiencing trauma, how our prefrontal cortex, we can't access it, and kids can't either. So how are we meeting kids where they are, meeting families where they are, meeting educators where they are, and recognizing where we are. I'm sure there's a lot of you that have families and kids and are impacted personally by the pandemic, and you're trying to do your job while making sure your own children's needs are being met. So trauma-informed approaches applies to us as providers as well. So here are some examples of types of school psychology services to do remotely. So holding remote IEP meetings or 504 evaluations. I know there's a ton of questions about doing IEP evaluations remotely. And there is really not clear answers. It would be defer to what your state and district is guiding you to do. NASP has some guidance about using some legal ethical decision making, making sure you're practicing within your competence and scope of competence, thinking about the impact remote administration could have on the validity of test results. So there's a lot of things to consider, and you really just need to defer to what your states and districts and supervisors are instructing you to do. Other examples might be, like in my district, all mental health providers held office hours so that any student or family could reach out if they needed mental health support. What that looked like for me was we used Google Hangouts in my district, and some of you might use different remote platforms. But I used Google Hangouts, and every day from 11 to 1, I was available for anybody to contact me and could respond. Crisis intervention. So in team meetings with different mental health providers or teachers, hearing that there's a family experiencing a crisis, or maybe there's a non-COVID related community crisis and we need to support. So how can school psychologists have a role in that? Maybe you're able to run some groups and think through the consent needed and in line with your district policies. Doing individual check-ins, so just quick, I'm touching base just for that human connection to just say, hey, how are you doing? Or maybe it's more individual counseling where you are still really working on some counseling goals and using some therapeutic techniques in a session. Maybe you're recording yourself with some social emotional learning videos. Different programs have given different permission for providers to record themselves. I believe Second Step is one of them. It's on their site. I link it later in this presentation. but maybe you bust out the puppy and the snail puppet and you record some videos of yourself, and that's a way you're going to try to do service provision. And then developing home programs targeting IEP goals. And I'll provide some examples of what those have looked like, at least for me. So again, on special education evaluations, make sure you're doing them on the platform designed for that purpose, and recognizing a lot of times we're relying on people in the home to help with some of the administration pieces and what the impact of that could be on results. Always thinking through validity and equity issues, and always in line with what your district is guiding you to do. And then it's worth looking to see if your state association has released a guidance document that can really help you as a school psychologist think about how you are going to approach remote evaluations. In Colorado, I know our association put one out. I believe Florida has one, Washington, California, Pennsylvania. So many states have guidance documents you guys can refer to. And I wish there was a more clear guideline here, but this is really unprecedented territory. And Kelly, I believe you just posted a Policy Matters blog about this was one of the main areas that school psychologists are wanting support in.
Yeah, and we're in the process right now of collecting a bunch of data from states to find out exactly how states have tackled this issue. I think some states have come up with some really creative and innovative ways to provide some flexibility while also making sure that we're preserving service delivery for students. But it is certainly, we heard from school psychologists across the country that this was an area of struggle.
So again, some more considerations for remote services, really thinking about how we need to modify or think through confidentiality agreements, knowing that we are going into people's homes, that when we're running groups, other people in homes can see other kids potentially with IEPs participating in groups, that the content that's shared might be within earshot of other people in the home. So just really thinking through what the agreements need to look like and what type of languages they need to be translated to. Setting boundaries for how and when you can be contacted. In Colorado, our school year usually runs August through May, and I'm actually on summer break now. But I've already had some students who I've been checking in with all quarter continue to message me. So thinking about how do we set those boundaries and making sure we're there as a support for kids, but also making sure that we can take care of ourselves and we're not constantly feeling like we need to be glued to our computer. Thinking through the use of technology, like knowing your own, like, hey, what areas do I need more training in? What technology do my kids and families understand how to use? You know, the majority of my families on my IEP caseload don't use email. They don't know how to check it. They don't have an email address. The kids are the ones teaching their parents how to use email, and sometimes their ability to share that information is really impacted. So how are we making sure that we're all understanding what platforms to use and how? Are you working within your area of competence? There's a lot of great PDs available right now. Like, let's say, hey, like, I'm not doing as many evaluations. I really want to support social emotional learning right now. I feel like I might need some PD to really strengthen that part of my practice. Now's a great time to do that. And then the sustainable wellness piece, which I kind of touched on in my district. This is kind of the model we came up with. I'm sorry it's blurry. I took it from their Facebook page. But not just going like, all right, self-care, I'm gonna take a bubble bath after work today because I need to decompress. But what are we really doing to avoid burnout, particularly with remote learning? Because Zoom burnout is a different type of burnout that I know I haven't experienced. So really having to rethink, what do I need to do as a provider to stay on top of things? Okay, so this is an example of what remote learning looks like for one school psychologist, me. So for each kid on my caseload, I had a home program. So I would write down, what are the IEP goals I'm working with? Maybe you don't service IEP goals directly for kids, but maybe this is something through a consulting role, you're able to help support those who are develop or working directly with kids or with case managers so that there are ways kids can continue to work on their IEP goals. So I have about 30 kids I provide direct services to, so I made 30 of them. Setting up weekly check-ins with students and their families, depending on the modality of communication that works for them. So even though I would prefer to do a Google Meet video for all of them, like I said, some of my families didn't have reliable internet or reliable housing or had never used email before. Talking Points was a really awesome app. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but it translates texts for you. And a lot of my families like to communicate from text. I had weekly team meetings with lots of different people within the school. I would hop onto the classroom Zoom meetings, and maybe if somebody's doing a goal about, you know, in class participation, like, hey, are you logging on to Zoom? What are you doing when you're in Zoom? Just kind of seeing what the learning looks like. Consulting with our teachers, a lot of times saying like, hey, this kiddo hasn't logged on, or hey, they sent a kind of weird message in the chat today for class, or they just looked really off today. Being able to kind of talk back and forth what the needs are. Doing suicide risk assessments. So having to do those remotely, how does that look different when you don't get to be face to face and don't have as much control over what, you know, if they hang up the phone or the family doesn't want to participate, what does that mean for us as providers? Holding remote IEP meetings, progress monitoring, advocacy, I think is a really important one. So those are all things I did. And here's an example of one of the home programs. Or I'm going to go through in a couple examples. A lot of this is stuff I've already covered. So for one example, so there was a student with autism, and their goal was about how to talk, like, I am having a problem, what are some solutions I can try, and being able to articulate that. This student also was really struggling because there was loss of structure, there was unlimited access to iPads, but they needed to share between 4 siblings to access their learning. So these were some strategies I came up with for this kid that I sent home to their family and talked through on the phone. So I made a little problem thermometer, like, hey, what's the size of my problem? Is what happened matching my reaction? A social story on COVID-19, which I'll link in a few slides. Because this student was really anxious and really hyper-focusing on talking about COVID and trying to know about COVID. So providing that resource for family and actually finding some resources in this student's native language was really exciting. Tons of availability of social emotional learning videos, so that even if you can't run a group or record yourself doing a group, those resources are available, and they can be as short as 5 minutes to longer. And then providing a sentence frame for the families to use, and then having weekly check-ins to say, hey, tell me about a problem you had this week. Like, what did you do? And honestly, it's been really cool to get to work so much with our families. That was something I think I grew as a provider through this. Was I don't always get to see what the families are doing at home, and working so closely with them and talking with them every week. So I think in that sense, that was a silver lining that I was excited to be a part of. Here was a student with a serious emotional disability, who's trying to figure out, like, what's stressing me out, what should I do about it, and is it working? So this was an older student. He was able to articulate, like, my mom still has to go to work. I'm really worried she's gonna get sick. This is a student who'd experienced loss of other family members. So we've known some of the triggers, able to come up with him, like, what are some of the strategies you wanna try? We're gonna keep a journal, and then we're gonna talk through them when we do our check-ins. Hey, mom, like, when I'm checking in with you, like, let's talk about what are some things you can say during your check-ins with your kiddo. And then let's have you continue to do some different social emotional learning videos so you can think of different coping strategies to try. So those are, I mean, the home programs weren't these big, elaborate, long complicated plans, there were some really clear steps and strategies for families and kids to use, and really meeting the families where they're at. I had some families say, I do not have the capacity to sit down and help my student through a small group. I can't do that. That is beyond what I'm capable of right now. I said, okay, like, let's think about some things that falls in a place where it's accessible to you and your child. Here are some COVID-19 children's books and social stories I found, and some of them in multiple language that I think have been really awesome to share. One kid was so excited when I found a book in his native language. He actually wanted to hang up with me so badly so that he could go read the book with his mom, because he was so excited it was something from his culture. So there's probably more you guys have used. These were a few that I found that were free. Here are some different social emotional learning resources that have free lessons. Some of them are only extended through June 30th for free. It really depends on the resource. Sesame Street consistently has awesome resources for kids. Strongly recommend Sesame Street. Some of them you sign up and they send you weekly emails. Some of them are ones kids can log in and do them directly themselves. So if you don't have the capacity or bandwidth, like maybe you have a bunch of kids at home and you're like, yeah, me recording a video with a bunch of puppets and going through a full lesson is beyond this reality of my world. That's okay, because there are other resources too. So it's a lot about, we all need to figure out what works for all of us right now. So these are just general questions about home services or kind of some of the ways I've provided school psychology services remotely.
So we did just get a question, and this is, I think, for you as well as other people in the chat. Has anyone conducted virtual testing? So I know, Brittany, is anyone in your district or even you done virtual evaluations so far, or are you planning to do that?
I will say for me, it's been a very case-by-case basis. And there definitely isn't a blanket, like, yes, we do them or no, we don't. It's really depending on what that case is and what we feel like we can do and have the results be valid. Yes, there are some school psychologists doing them. Yes, across the state and country, there are psychologists doing remote evaluations. I haven't done many.
Great. So another question was, when you're talking about, coordinating with your teams and implementing services for your students that are on IEPs, how have you handled the situations where, you mentioned that some families are just burnt out, they don't have the bandwidth to do a lot of this stuff. How have you handled it where a student might be, they might have an IEP where there are many different service providers? So there's a school psychologist and a speech path and an OT and a PT. How have you guys managed the scheduling so that it's manageable for families, but that it's also helping make sure that students are getting access to the support that they need?
That's a great question, and something our team talked a lot about at the beginning of our remote learning. Some providers might make their resources available through a Google Classroom. So like an occupational therapist might have like, hey, like this is my weekly lesson. You can log in and access it versus I'm going to call you every week to check in and monitor. So using Google Classrooms was one way. For families that were, honestly, I was shocked that there weren't very many families that were like, do not contact me. Most of them wanted to hear from a mental health provider. And a lot of them wanted to hear from everyone on their team. We also talked about, as a team, does it make sense for some families to have the case manager be the one to coordinate those services? So they're going to do one check-in, or maybe we'll schedule a whole Zoom chat or Google Meet chat. So kind of just thinking creatively with what works for your team and community.
Great. So there is another question, and I think a lot of people are probably thinking about how this could work in the future, but have you combined online or distance learning with face-to-face classroom instruction? I guess, maybe not necessarily during the pandemic, but at any point, have you done a hybrid model? And if so, how has that worked?
I have not done a hybrid model. I believe a lot of districts are talking about a hybrid model for the fall, but I'm not sure what that will look like. So if anybody has experience with that, maybe you can put it in the chat box, because I unfortunately can't answer that question.
So while we're giving folks a chance to ask more questions if they have one, I have one for you, because I know that, and that question was a good segue. I think districts are going to be in different places in the fall. Some might be doing hybrid, some might be completely online. And so I'm curious, given your experience serving these kids remotely, are there any lessons that you have learned? Are there things that you might do differently or that you're planning to do differently as you think about how we're going to transition into a new school year? So, assuming the first 6 weeks of the next school year are remote, would you change anything about how you've structured the way that you've serviced your kids so far and your families?
It's a great question. I'm really crossing my fingers and hoping very hard that there will be the opportunity to do some face-to-face with some of the kids. I'd love to be able to have times where if I'm holding office hours, maybe some of them can be at my building, or figuring out ways to do more home visits. That would be really, really great. I think one big thing I learned about some of my kids is that, especially some of my students with autism or who have a lot of social anxiety, I had some deeper and richer conversations with them remotely than I have ever had face-to-face. I think it broke down some of those barriers and personal anxieties for them. So I would really like to think, really look at what's working for my kids and try to get past my own, what works best for me and what do I like best, and see what are actually kids responding to the best. So I think constantly keeping in my mind, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. I need to make it manageable for me, but where are my kids flourishing?
I think we're good. I don't see any more questions, so I think we're good to keep
going. All right,
going.
and we're just about finished, so we're almost done. Just kind of thinking about what do we do for remote risk assessment. I'm not sure how many school psychologists do crisis response, but that's definitely an area of expertise and training for school psychologists. A lot of them have been through prepare training, and we're in the midst of a global crisis right now. So I think this is a time to really think about using these skills. So yes, we can do remote suicide risk assessments. They're going to look really differently depending on what your district structure looks like. Again, I referenced before, NASP has some guiding documents. If your district's looking to think about what the protocol should be for your school, we know that COVID-19 is increasing rates of depression and anxiety across the board. So I think we would assume there would be more happening. And then just keeping in mind that ultimately it's caregivers that are going to be the ones to give consent to do these. We're going into people's homes to do them. It's been a tricky thing to navigate with, we're not doing them in a school building. We're being invited into somebody's home to conduct them. So utilize your NASP resources, keeping that connection, knowing you still need to and can call 911 if your connection is dropped or there's an imminent threat that you feel is happening, and then teaming. Like working with your district teams, working with your school teams, getting guidance when you feel like you need it. And then just really, how can we ensure that our kids' basic needs are being met? I think we're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy right now, and making sure that kids have access to food and internet and housing and food. So how are we partnering with people in our community? There have been amazing positive stories when you look to see the creative ways people have come together to support each other right now. So my school did remote home visits. So we had a team, some of our paraprofessionals, our family liaisons, some of our front office staff, and some of our staff that were multilingual really set up times to just be like, we're just going to say, like, what does your family need? Are you guys having a hard time getting food? Hey, here's some resources. Here's a resource about rent assistance. How are you doing there? To really just have that constant connection and making sure that because we know kids can't learn if they don't have their basic needs met. So I think that was something I wasn't directly involved in, but I saw being really powerful in my school community was just those, are you okay kind of calls. And then what is it going to look like when we come back? I know someone mentioned, will it be hybrid learning? Are people going to stay remote? Are some states going to go to full face-to-face instruction, and what will that look like? I don't think anyone's 100% sure, but keeping in mind those trauma-informed practices and how important we're going to be in schools, and how much schools really, and kids need access to school psychology, especially our kids that have disabilities, especially our kids whose consistency has been really interrupted, who, when they don't get some of their services, it really impacts their ability to make growth. Making sure we're staying connected, connecting with our kids, connecting with our families, connecting with our colleagues. How is teletherapy going to play into it? I don't know. I know there have been different guidelines coming out about what teletherapy, guidelines have been relaxed or rules have been altered during this time, and what does that mean for us as providers? And then just giving yourself grace. I mean, we truly are all figuring this out and doing the absolute best we can. And there's definitely not a perfect way to do this. So just really relying on your colleagues and talking to each other and collaborating for new ideas will be really important. So thanks for letting me talk to you guys about just what one school psychologist who's lucky enough to work within a ratio of 1 to 500 has been able to do remote learning. I really appreciate everyone's time. If there's any final questions, I know we're just about out of time, but I really appreciate getting to talk about the best career in the whole world with you guys.
So there is one question. Hold on, I just lost it because someone, let's see. In talking about, PTSD and, which is it's a very clinical diagnosis, but when we're thinking about, I think, just the collective trauma that is being experienced by students and families and staff to some extent, I think we're all experiencing trauma in our own way. Do you have any suggestions for how schools should think about handling that as they look to reopen after summer, regardless of what that reopening actually looks like? And then one more question to tack on to that is, in addition, this could probably play into that, is what steps should we keep in mind to make sure that we're protecting student privacy and confidentiality as we are continuing to serve them in this new modality?
Sure. So I think to kind of talk about the first question, really making sure that not only our kids have access to mental health providers, but we have access to mental health providers and that we're able to care for ourselves. Making sure that districts are communicating if you have an employee assistance program or opportunities for staff to be able to get their needs met, that we're looking out for each other and kind of looking for those signs of anxiety in each other. I think grace. There have been some colleagues I've talked to, they're like, oh my gosh, I've heard like you're supposed to be on call from this time to this time, no exceptions. And like, but I have kids and they don't have childcare and I don't know about childcare and I don't know how I'm doing all this. So just, I think giving each other some flexibility and some really clear expectations. It is a very uncomfortable feeling to not know what to expect. And we know that for kids, but we're all experiencing that now too. So I think as much communication as districts can give not only our students, but their staff of like, this is what's expected of you, can really help manage expectations for us. And then Kelly, can you say the second question? I think it was about confidentiality.
Yeah, it's what are some steps that we should keep in mind to protect student privacy and confidentiality?
Definitely consult with your district. A lot of districts might have a lawyer that's helping look over what different confidentiality agreements might look like, but some of the documents we might have used in the past aren't going to cover like, hey, now your student has an IEP, but in order for me to provide a group, if you want them to, other families and kids might be seeing what we talk about or know that your student is a part of a group of students with IEPs. So how are we modifying our informed consent so that parents are really informed of what remote services looks like and what that means for their kids' privacy and their privacy as a family? Some families aren't super thrilled to have people on little video screens in their home and in their personal life. I had a kid in a very panicked moment walk me through a house and open doors, and I was like, please let everyone be like okay with me coming into their room unannounced. So informed, I think, is the big part of confidentiality, informed consent. What does that look like now? Same with testing. How do we keep test materials private, I think, is a question. I personally don't have a ton of answers about all of that other than just really ask those questions to your district, to your supervisors, making sure that you guys are getting guidance on that. And it's not 100% just being left up to you all the time.
I think that's it. I think the questions have stopped coming in. So.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely. I just wanted to remind everyone that we will be posting the recording on ELA's YouTube page, which I did link in the chat if you want to keep that open on your computer so that whenever it's uploaded today, you'll see it. And we'll also, again, be sharing the slides with everyone for you to reference. But thank you all. Do feel free to participate in any future ELA office hours or webinars. Thank you, Brittany and Kelly, for both participating. Also, I don't know if you want to go to the slide with your contact information. If
that would be helpful.
If people wanted to reference either of your emails, they're there on your screen now, and you're welcome to reach out for further resources. Yeah, with that, we're all set. So again, thanks everyone for participating, and we'll see you all soon.